Hi, my name is Leslie Blair, and this is my midterm video for Homicide Studies. I chose as an explanation for homicide and homicidal behavior to look into honor killings. They're actually mentioned not in chapter 4, but they come up in a couple different other places in the book, and I'm just really intrigued by the idea of honor killings. And what's discussed in the book is actually more honor killings in that typically are females being murdered by family members to appease or to earn back the honor of the family because the family's honor was disgraced by the female's actions. And in looking into that a little bit further, there's a lot of research on it, and it tends to be extremely conservative Muslim cultures in the Middle East in particular that have these extreme views of Islam, that are incredibly misogynistic and controlling of females. And so, I was intrigued by that idea, but in looking into honor killings and this idea of honor in terms of homicide, I came across this idea of the culture of honor, particularly in the southern United States. So it was this idea, I'm just going to turn my camera around, hopefully you guys can see that. This Self-Protection and the Culture of Honor, Explaining Southern Violence by Cohen and Nisbet. They were the original authors of this idea, and I think this is from the 90s, to explain why the homicide rate actually is higher in southern states, does tend to be higher in southern states. And so they were trying to explain that by this idea of a culture of honor among particularly southern white men is what they were originally looking at. And interestingly, they said that this idea came from, their explanation for why this culture of honor came about is due to the South being historically, in terms of European immigration and settlement, being historically a hurting communities where law enforcement was not really able to, or wasn't around to really help with any sort of disputes around livestock and the theft of livestock and things like that. And Cohen and Nisbet's argument is that Southern white men, predominantly that were herders, had to adopt this idea of toughness and a reputation for retaliation and violence, to deter people from stealing their livestock. So I thought it was interesting that Cohen and Nisbet were talking about the need for these Southern white men to kind of take the law into their own hands because of the lack of law enforcement of, people stealing their livestock and things like that. And then they argue that, that has then been passed down to children, this idea of defending yourself and defending your honor and defending your property and your family. And there's a lot of talk about how that, kind of translates into the stand your ground laws and the gun culture in the South and things like that. So there's a lot of interesting ideas with this Southern culture of honor. So that was something that piqued my interest. And then looking into it further and reading more about it, it just very much reminded me of the Code of the Streets, which is a theory by Elijah Anderson from 1999 about, I believe, northern, because I think it was an ethnography in a northern community that he visited in the 90s to come up with this idea of the Code of the Streets in urban Black communities. And this idea that, again, when law enforcement isn't trusted or isn't enforcing laws, there comes this need or this feeling to take the law into your own hands and be seen as tough and be seen as someone that shouldn't be disrespected. Respect is a big thing in the Code of the Streets, that, the idea of dissing, like if, someone disses you, you need to retaliate, or you need to, aggressively protect your reputation and things like that. That also, was argued to be something that was passed down. And then I found this great article. Hopefully you can see that there. The cultural ecology of gun violence, culture of honor, and code of the street, which is actually exactly comparing these two theories. And so the overlap, I'm kind of just reading my notes here from that article. The overlap between the two theories that this Arthur Whaley articulated in this article is that the two theories are both taught to children and passed down that way. They're a response to distrust or lack of law enforcement and the need to project a reputation of toughness and, someone that you shouldn't mess with because, they will violently protect their reputation or their family or things like that. That was an interesting kind of difference between, and I'm not sure if I have that in any of my notes for any of my articles here. Is this the one? Let me see. Nope, I think it was a different article that looked at, I don't remember what exactly it looked at, but the conclusion kind of was that in the Southern culture of violence or this, culture of honor in the South, there is a need to protect women. The idea that it's part of the culture of honor that we as men, white men in the South, protect the women in our lives. At the same time, there's a lot of misogyny in those Southern cultures as well. But, at least outwardly, the idea is that we protect our women, which I just thought was an interesting juxtaposition from the honor killings that are not protecting women. They're protecting the reputation and the quote unquote honor of the family by murdering women that they see as not being honorable. So I just thought that was an interesting juxtaposition between the two kind of honor theories. So the other articles that I found that I thought were interesting was this gun groups and Southern culture of honor, considering the role of co-offenders in Southern firearm violence. So I thought that was particularly interesting because I think in their findings, do I have a notes on their findings? I don't have the notes on what they actually found here, but a big kind of takeaway of this article and the fact that they even did this idea of co-offenders being involved and how that impacts the Southern culture of honor. Just reminding me of the elements of confrontational homicide, right? With having an audience. And so if I recall correctly, like I said, I don't have my notes on the details of this article, but if I recall correctly, the idea was that, if there is a co-offender, a person is more likely to feel that they need to, live up to the culture of honor, right? So it's this kind of idea of an audience and being egged on and being, how am I going to be perceived by this other person who I respect or want the respect of? So I thought that was an interesting article. So here's another article, Boys Round Here, the relationship between masculine honor ideology, aggressive behavior, race, and regional affiliation. So I do have some notes here. The masculine honor ideology predicted history of physical aggression. So they actually looked at various types of aggression. They actually used a scale to measure this honor ideology and how much people believed in it. It's a region only predicted the masculine honor ideology for white men. So northern white men were less likely to adhere to this masculine honor ideology than southern white men. But that also kind of meant that black men in their study were higher on the masculine honor ideology than white or Hispanic men. And that was regardless of region. And so I thought that was interesting too, because I think that maybe potentially we see again that overlap with the code of the streets, right? Is that that black men, and even Elijah Anderson would say, and obviously none of these things are universal, right? I'm not trying to generalize all people, but in this study, it's interesting that Black men were higher in this idea of honor ideology, masculine honor ideology across the board, regardless of region, because perhaps some of this code of the street idea is coming into play there. And I also think it's interesting. I think there was another article that I didn't include here that I thought was interesting about the migration, historical migration of African Americans from slavery in the South to other areas. And so is there an influence there as well, historical influence on this masculine honor ideology for Black men? And of course, the other thing that I think is incredibly interesting about the overlap of the Code of the Streets and this culture of honor is, again, the lack of law enforcement, or the explanation that it was the lack of law enforcement that led to this culture of honor, and also Code of the Streets, right? They had to take matters into their own hands. I don't think I've talked about this one yet. So this is the cultural ecology of gun violence. Oh, wait. Nope. I did just talk about that one. This is the one I haven't talked about yet. Why is the murder rate higher in the South than in other parts of the United States? Southern subculture of violence or legacy of slavery? So this one kind of got into a little bit of that idea of, is it slavery? Because Glenn Walters here talks about how there was a need in the South for when slavery was active, for Southern slave owners to be incredibly aggressive in policing. And side note, that's where policing in America comes from, is from slave patrols. But that's just a little side note. But it had to be incredibly aggressively and violently policed in the South. And so Glenn Walters is arguing, hey, maybe that's coming into play here a little bit too. So he claims to have found support, just reading my little note here, he claims to have found support for both the influence of the Southern and the subculture of violence and former slave owning for increased homicide rates. So this is an article where I found they actually looked directly at homicide rates. However, I didn't really love how, just from a research methods perspective, I didn't love how he actually measured it. He did did control for some things, but he didn't actually ever measure this idea of a Southern subculture of violence. He kind of just took it as a given and looked just at the homicide rates in Southern states and defined them as Southern states based on whether they seceded, whether they fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, and also neighboring states. So, but he did claim to find support for both, which I thought was somewhat interesting, because I think it speaks to just another explanation of perhaps why this Southern subculture of violence came to be. Not just, as Cohen and Nisbet, the original authors of the theory, claimed that it was because of the, legacy or the herding culture from the early European settlers. This is also, at least Glenn Walters is claiming that perhaps some of that also comes from the legacy of slavery and having to violently enforce slavery in the South. So that's what I researched. So I hope you liked it, and hope you found it as interesting as I did.